Hello, Professor Danny Blanchflower, and a special thanks for appearing on our 100th episode of SCOTONOMICS.
Oh, 100. Good.
Yes.
Centenary celebration.
Over the last few years, much of your research has focused on this concept of well-being. Could you outline what you mean when you talk about well-being? And also, I would be interested to what made you look at this, because it's not where you would think a member of the MPC would naturally go.
Well, I actually, you might think it is. I mean, if you well, a couple of things. The first thing, I was a person who worked on wages. And when you look at wages and how wages are determined, it's the same in Botswana, Scotland, Ireland, America, Peru. The same patterns occur in the data. So then I started to think about well-being. And in economics, we talk about utility, right? We think about why do we do economic activity? I mean, you can go back to Smith. Smith talks about raising the wealth of nations, but wealth in itself, it's not wealth in itself, it's what wealth does. And I also started to think, well, we don't, as a central bank, you care about inflation and unemployment and interest rates, but actually those aren't just intermediate goods. You care about well-being. And I was actually in Scotland last year for the tercentenary of Adam Smith's birth, and in the theory of moral sentiments, Smith starts out much before you get to the wealth of nations. He talks about people care about the well-being of others. The first 2 pages of the theory of moral sentiments are about well-being and the well-being of others. So I started to think about, maybe we should think about well-being. Maybe there's some evidence talking to people. I started to think about a couple of things. Consumer confidence data is also a measure of happiness in some ways. But the other thing I started to spend a lot of time with in my early work was actually about firms. And I used to start to think, well, there's actually a lot of economists spend their lives looking at business confidence surveys. They're called PMIs. They're called the Bank of England has agents that talk to businesses. In the United States, the Beige Book is a publication every month from the 12 banks around the United States, where they talk to people and ask them about their well-being. So I sort of essentially started to think about, well, what if you're interested in firm well-being, like how do you think things are going? Are you going to invest in stuff? Are you going to hire people? Are you going to fire people? Well, that turns out to have really good predictive power. So then I started to think about, certainly in 2008, I started to think about what I call the economics of walking about, which is just a classic one. In the early 2008, I started to think that maybe retail sales were falling. And I gave a whole series of interviews, and I was in a cab in Oxford Street. And I'm talking to the guy, and he goes, I know you. I know your voice. You're on the MPC, aren't you? And I said, yeah. And it was in early March, I think, early January 2008. And he said, well, I want to show you something. He said, I've spotted something. So we're driving up and down Oxford Street. And he said, do you notice anything? He said, I've noticed something for the first time in 30 years. And I went, well, what's that? And he said, look around you. And I looked, and he said, for the first time in 30 years, people haven't got shopping bags. Well, it turns out that was true. People had stopped buying stuff. So you ask people, how do you feel? Yeah. Well, it turns out, so then we're starting to think about well-being like that. And then I started to think, well, okay, I remember my good pal John Abowd, famous economist, being chief economist at the Census Bureau, and said to me once, Danny, does this stuff have any predictive power? And the answer is, it turns out it does. So just to give you a couple of examples, if you ask some experiments with students, you ask people, how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10? And then you take their arm and you take a skin biopsy, and you can predict how fast the skin heals by how happy they were in the question you've asked. Another one, new recent work says if you take people at age 70 in the United States and ask them how happy they are, that predicts how long they're going to live for. That it literally predicts mortality. So that's the first thing. And so we start to think about, well, do these measures of well-being mean anything? Do they move as the cycle moves? Do they have predictive power? It turns out that these measures of consumer confidence predict rises and changes in unemployment. They predict things. So I've started to work a lot on that. And I started to think about, well, what impacts well-being? Well, it turns out, so something seen in the newspaper the last few days, So apparently the Chancellor thinks that the unemployed are lazy and that benefits are too high. Well, that actually turns out to be absolute, complete, and total hogwash. On every single thing you ever see in any data file about unemployment or about well-being, unemployment makes people less happy. So if it was just lazy swines who decided unemployment's great, then you ought to see that it made them happy. Well, that's just
there's a strong connection to suicide rates as well, isn't there, with unemployment, and ill health and obesity and a huge array.
About smoking and not establishing relationships, not getting married, all of that stuff. And so the idea, I I tweeted about, I thought it was one of the most stupid things I've ever heard. The reason that people are unemployed is they can't find a job. The jobs that are available are not at the skill set that they have. Maybe they're in Glasgow and they're looking for a job as a painter, and there's plenty of jobs painting in East London. Well, they don't have a house there, they don't have a mechanism of getting there. And if you go back to the Full Monty, I always remember the Full Monty. Why did those guys in Sheffield end up being strippers? Well, they didn't want to do that. The reason was they couldn't find a job for love nor money. And it was the only thing they could do to find a job. So I always remember that. So anyway, so this is a great deal about that. I'm also interested in things like, well, can you validate it? And it turns out that if you look at happiness and unhappiness, it's very much like things like pulse rates. It turns out if you model people's pulse rates, that looks awfully like what they say about happiness. So that validates things. If you look at the taking of antidepressants, you look at admissions to psychiatric. So there's a great deal of stuff that you can get from well-being. So I was interested in it as a central banker. And I think, and what you see in the data is that the Great Recession comes along and hits well-being like crazy, right? And so that has, and the rise in unemployment hurts people. So you really ought to think about to what extent are people hurt by things, who's hurt the most. And so that's a great deal of what I've been doing. And I've written lots and lots of papers on it. And then all of a sudden in the last 12 months, I've had to sort of backtrack on things that I've worked on over the last 15 years, because I'm a data guy. And you look at the data, and I suddenly started to look at the data, and things that I'd seen in the past no longer were present. So now had a huge transformation in this field. And Larry Elliott has a column last Sunday about the work that I've been doing, and we can talk more about it. But this is really scary. This is now scary evidence. Suddenly has transformed the world.
Now in the world, and we'll get into your paper and your ideas around kind of why younger people have such poor well-being. But we're in a point where a lot of these people were born in 2008, or were maybe entering the jobs market, and then we had like a COVID. So this last 15-year period has been unlike any 15-year period before. And you would expect that to change the data, wouldn't you? You've got to kind of look at that and start using that.
Well, I mean, in a way, the biggest puzzle about these data is essentially what you would have thought, that the Great Recession was something that's driving things. But actually, we can't really empirically prove that, because, well, what I'm going to talk about. So I just explain what was happened. So a great deal of what we've seen in the past, particularly driven in the United States, was a big rise in the ill-being of prime age, less educated whites. And so Case and Deaton have written about that. And you think about ill-being, hump-shaped in age. So what Case and Deaton wrote about was that, that drug overdoses, suicides, alcohol poisoning peaked in midlife. And you might think that these groups of people who were left behind were exactly the people who voted for Trump, who voted for Le Pen in France, and to some degree voted for Brexit in Britain. And so that was the driving force that this group of people have done particularly badly. And there's a hump shape in ill-being and a happiness U-shape. Well, what's happened since 2011, and it's 2011 that's really the starting point, is globally, particularly, we started out looking at the US and the UK, but what we've seen is a huge rise in the ill-being of the young, such that this hump shape is now gone. Ill-being just declines in age. And so we've seen this enormous, terrible phenomenon, which starts in 2011, and the trend rises, and then you get to COVID. But COVID clearly is not the cause, because the trend is already there. 2011 to 2020 is here, and then you get to COVID, and COVID exacerbates and extends it. And now we get to 2020, and I'm doing lots of work for the United Nations, trying to think about this around the world. And basically now it turns out this is a global phenomenon. The young are the most mentally hurting group in 100 countries that we've looked at: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, really? Egypt, everywhere around the globe. And obviously the question is, why? And a great deal of it has basically starts in 2011, and it particularly impacts young women. Well, what's the thing that's correlated to it? So John Haidt and Jean Twenge have written a lot about, and I have too now. And their argument is that it's correlated with the rise in smartphones and internet usage. And you can show that the group whose unhappiness has risen the most is young women. And young women's use of the internet and smartphones exploded. And so the story is about this rising in internet usage and other things. And there's lots of thoughts about what you do in schools. And John Haidt has talked a lot about it. And, the UK government's thought about it. And the governor of Florida is trying to. But the answer is that there are things that you can do in a school. But I'm a professor at Dartmouth and at Glasgow. And the question is, well, what do you do about that at Dartmouth? Can you ban cell phones? No. What are you going to do about it? How are you going to try and slow this thing down? And the world doesn't know the answer to that. You might in a school. The evidence in schools is that if you can take the cell phones away, people engage more, they bully less. This is a good move to do. But parents don't like this, and we can talk more about it. But I think we have the #1 global thing, which the United Nations is all over now. The #1 global problem that we have is that the well-being of kids under 25 has collapsed.
Yeah, well, that is fascinating.
All the research that we wrote, all the stuff we did about I've got a paper where I talk about 650 published papers, talk about the midlife crisis, gone. The data simply think of the hump. There's the hump, and all that's happening on the left-hand side. The ill-being of the young has risen. And as I said, I thought it was about the US. Then I looked at the UK. Then I went to Australia, New Zealand. We've now looked in lots of other places: France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Norway, the Czech Republic. And then we started to look in other places. And as I say, I'm now at 100 countries, and there's basically, everywhere. So countries as diverse as Algeria, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, Egypt, Peru, Guatemala, everywhere, Canada. And so this is a new phenomenon. And the reality is we don't know what to do about it, but everywhere around globally. I've just got to go and give testimony next week to the California legislature, who are panicking. What are we going to do? And so this is going to be the #1 global phenomenon in the next 5 years, I would argue. And partly because we have no clue what to do about it.
Noticed you sent a tweet out a couple of days ago that you said you're interested on people's views. Why the big decline in well-being? So you've kind of really focused on smartphone use on the internet. What did other people say?
So obviously a lot of people talk about COVID. A lot talk about that, but obviously my response to that is, well, it's not COVID because it all happened before it. You would think, as you rightly said at the beginning, you'd think it had to do with the Great Recession, but think of the logic here. So what you see from 2011 is a big rise in cell phone usage, a big rise in the ill-being of the young as the unemployment rate comes down. It doesn't have the right sign. Right. Yeah. And you can't really, despite the fact you ought to think that a Great Recession comes. Well, maybe the removal of public services. But here's the thing, which is pretty hard for me. My first pass at this was to go and look at, in the United States, we have data, and we have it in the UK now too. I started to look at data for high school kids. So look at data for 14 to 18-year-olds in 2011. And what you see is that the ill-being of 14-year-olds in high schools starts to deteriorate from 2011. It's hard to argue, right, that that's because of rising unemployment. Well, maybe. So we've started to do things like, to what extent would you think the ill-being of 14-year-olds is driven by the Great Recession and labor market stuff? And to this point, we can't find any evidence for that. So my first point was, well, okay, if it was happened to 15-year-olds in 2014, they're unlikely to have been impacted by the labor market or by, so a lot of research is going on. But to this point, nobody's been able to show you that. So obviously there's things like the breakdown of the family, the removal of public services, all of that.
These are kind of the classic reasons, aren't they? The bowling alone type kind of response.
But you need three things here to be able to explain it. The first is why 2011? Well, it's a king, right? Everything you show, all the things you said is true, and then it's 2011, suddenly this thing starts. Second, why does it apply especially to young women? I mean, roughly the story is it applies to young men, and the survey, the series run together, but it's always worse for young women. And then why is it everywhere? It can't be because of, because it can't be, Osborne put in austerity in 2010. Well, how does that explain what happened in Pakistan, Algeria, and Peru, right? So it can't be a US, UK centric thing. So in a sense, the story about why it goes back to cell phones is that you see the cell phone coverage in place. I mean, I've just been looking at data from the UN about things like the use of smartphones, where it turns out that smartphone usage in Africa pretty much in many African countries passes the US in 2010. And so we have to find something that's universal, something that particularly kinks from 2011, and something that applies especially for women. So there's been various people trying to argue about causality and all the rest of it. The problem is they have to come up with another explanation, right? If it isn't cell phones and it isn't smartphones,
what is it?
What is it? and you ain't come up with anything, and it doesn't really matter in the sense that we then have to find out what are we going to do about these. I mean, so the data I'll give you in America, essentially the data that I have in my head in America is that when asked the question over the last 30 days, how many of those 30 days were bad mental health days? 11% of girls between 18 and 24 say every day. Every day of my life is a bad mental health day. We have consistent evidence for the UK as well. We call that despair. So if you have 10% of your young people saying this, well, then we worry about what the implications will be. They won't perform well in the labor market. They won't establish families. They won't. They'll become unemployed, and perhaps more disastrous things. They'll be sick. There'll be mental consequences. So the society. So again, I'm going to talk to the California legislature, and I said, I don't really know what to do, but my advice to you is go and spend a whole load of money and try and think about what to do that'll work.
No, it's. I think for me, you've highlighted the huge variety of problems that affect a society and affect an economy, and we're still unable to even
But think go back. But go back in a sense to here's this trend that was going on that I hadn't really spotted, starting in 2011. So think about what George Osborne did. He cuts youth clubs, he cuts policing, he cuts libraries, he cuts swimming pools, he cuts social support for young people. They stop building schools. They don't deal with that. So as you're doing this mental health crisis of the young is coming, and you're doing everything you possibly can to harm them. That's what the reality is. So even though it didn't cause it, this collapse of public services, the collapse of, think about, I mean, there's apparently some huge number of kids now that are being, the GPs are saying should go and get mental health care and help, because now we're 12 years into this crisis. But what did the government do? Cut spending on the NHS, cut spending, not enough GPs, 7 million people on wait lists. So now these kids who are in a very bad situation, there's no help for them. Well, that's the fault of Osborne and the cuts of public spending and the lack of investing in the healthcare crisis, because they missed this terrible crisis amongst the young. So they've done exactly the opposite of what they should have done as this crisis was emerging that they didn't spot. Just like the Great Recession, they didn't spot. They didn't spot the crisis that Michael Marmot and others have been calling for, the rise in child poverty. The child poverty and all this situation going on is not unrelated to, you might think it's not unrelated to the rise in inequality, but what are you doing about the fact that now huge chunks of your young people are in trouble. And what are you doing about it, Chancellor?
Yeah.
You're arguing about taking benefits away from the disabled.
Absolutely.
You're arguing about removing things. So you're precisely doing the opposite of what you should be doing.
This is quite a good example, I think, for me, of this kind of mission-orientated approach that, you know, that Mariana Mazzucato talks about.
Yeah, sure.
And I think the Scottish government have said, we want to eradicate child poverty. And that's like a mission kind of statement. And, you know, this is really topical at the moment because we've got a new administration that's prioritized economic growth. And it's linked economic growth to this ability to eradicate poverty and deliver a better future. And I don't think I'm paraphrasing by saying that they're saying without economic growth, we can't do any of these things. And it's only with economic growth that we can. There's nothing new about that, right? But the Labour are also talking about how the economy needs to grow. And I just kind of really wanted your thoughts on this kind of connection, this understanding that when we've got economic growth, does well-being sometimes always definitely get better? Does GDP lead to an increase in well-being?
So to help, think about helping these young people. You say we can't really afford to spend money unless we've got more economic growth. But you haven't a clue, right? I mean, Mariana tries to talk about, but we don't really know how to raise productivity. We don't really know why. For example, the French produce in 4 days what the British produce in 5. We don't really know the answer to that. But supposing the country was invaded, or God forbid, had another pandemic. So when the pandemic comes, did they say we can't afford to pay for the pandemic unless we have growth? Would we just, you know, the country's going to be invaded, just run the white flag up and say, oh, we can't afford to do that? Well, the answer here is maybe you should be investing in the future of the country by investing in trying to eradicate child poverty, because that might well, in fact, raise productivity. So I don't really think you say, you know, we wait for economic growth. Maybe you invest in your people, which is how you get economic growth, right? I mean, think about how you would grow the economy here. You have all these people in inactivity. You have these young people who say they got long COVID, but maybe long COVID is nothing more than the ill-being of the young. It's just another way of saying it, right? So how could you generate economic growth where you could get 1 million people out of inactivity and you could get them working? That would raise taxes. I mean, I say raise tax. That would raise tax take. So I think this is a mistaken thought. Invest in your people. Think of it as, you know, what happened in the pandemic. Did he say we can't go and borrow money? Well, go and invest in the future. And not least because we don't exactly know the answer to those productivity questions. So I think the answer is get your people back to work, offer them real opportunities. And if you have to tax the rich, then you tax the rich. That's fine.
Does economic growth lead to better well-being?
The answer is not necessarily. So imagine the economy grows and the benefits of the growth go entirely to people in the City of London, say, right? Or to the benefits of growth go to the top 5% and they don't go to the rest. So actually distribution and inequality really matters here. We don't see an obvious connection between growth and well-being because distribution matters. Relative things matter, right? So here's the story. I mean, in a sense, the story has been in the United States. So let's go back to the story for the United States. Over the last 40 years, you say GDP in the United States has risen. Happiness hasn't. If anything, it's fallen. So there's no obvious connection, right, between growth and well-being. No obvious connection at all. Why would it be there? If we keep saying economic growth is going to generate a rise in well-being, why has it not done that in the last 50 years in the United States? It hasn't. So I think distribution matters. Go back to Smith. Smith says we care about the well-being of others. And so here's the story in a way. If my income rises by 10%, well, I go buy a Mercedes. And you say, haha, I'm so much happier. Well, actually, what if you go buy a Mercedes as well? Turns out that my happiness doesn't rise because relative to you, right? I mean, there's all sorts of experiments been done, right? So think of the experiment. Would you like the following choices? You get 6 and everybody else gets 4, or you get 5 and everybody else gets 1. Well, you've been offered the choice between 6 and 5. So economics says you should choose 6. Well, huge chunks of people choose 5-1 because relative to everybody else, they're better off. And relative thing matters. And obviously the other issue is, who do you compare yourself to, right? And obviously with social media and other things, people may well be comparing themselves differently than they were in the past. This could be about some of the story about why the young are so unhappy is maybe they've been, they've got opened a world of social media where they're comparing themselves to successful, people on the internet. And no longer are they comparing themselves to little Jimmy down the street, who's just like them, got a bicycle and, their parents are pretty much the same. Now they're comparing themselves to the son of some billionaire. So I think the answer is it's not simple to argue that growth generates well-being. I think the big thing is who you compare yourself to and what do you do with that growth. And if you decide you're going to make the poor poorer and give it all to, to the friends of the Tories, well, the well-being of the country doesn't rise, but the well-being of your pals might have. But
certainly some people
the well-being of your pals who live in, West London may have all risen on the backs of the declining well-being of the rest. So I think that Labour's on this and has to start to think about, and Gordon Brown was on it. I mean, personally, I would be happier to see a decline in poverty. I would rather a decline in poverty than,
Firstly, you've just defined capitalism for me, which was good. So thanks for that.
Well-being of your pals who live in, West London may have all risen on the backs of the declining well-being of the rest.
And the second point about it is we're talking about that question around Scotland, and the two things are clearly linked in Scotland.
Absolutely.
And I think, and I've certainly got an issue with that. I actually think that raising GDP might reduce well-being depending on how you measure it.
Well, think about who gets the benefits from it.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, remember economics. And what was the famous quote about economics, which is that, what was it? Economics can understand efficiency, but the optimal allocation of resources may still be perfectly disgusting, right?
Yes.
Because economics has little to say about distribution. Yeah. And I think so. If you think, well, so the economy doesn't grow as much, but the health of the population rises. Down the road, that'll raise productivity, and you reduce child poverty, and you remove the wait list from 7 million to 400. Right? So would the country feel better off if that happened? I suspect it would. If you have the choice, I'll get rid of child poverty and remove the wait list on the health service, we'll invest in those things. Would the country's well-being be better than simply a burst for growth where you have free ports? And, I suspect if the public was given that choice, they'd choose the former, not the latter. I would.
You mentioned about this investing in the future to reduce waiting lists and all of that. But I know you'll be aware that the Scottish government has hardly any borrowing powers, and it's not a currency issuing government, so it can't create currency and spend it. It actually has less borrowing powers than one of the local authorities in Scotland, if you can believe that. So if you're advising the Scottish government and you're saying to them, the new economic secretary comes to you and says, I'm going to push for 2% GDP growth every year over the next decade. If that's what she said to you, and she said to you, how can we do it? What tools have we got where we can actually push towards that type of level of growth?
The answer is that it depends what you're fighting against. Right? It depends on what the central bank is doing. Depends what the Treasury is doing. Depends what regional policy is. So imagine you're pushing for 2% growth, whereas the central government is doing something else, right? I mean, you're pushing for it, but the Bank of England doesn't care about unemployment in Scotland. So it keeps interest rates unmercifully too high. And your ideas of trying to generate 2% growth are extremely limited. And so obviously that my view would be that that's a problem. And obviously, if there's going to be an independent Scottish government, it's going to have borrowing power.
You may be aware of the success of the Scottish government's child payment, which is a kind of £25 weekly payment for people who are also on certain benefits. And the FT recently described it as turning Scotland into a European pioneer in reducing child deprivation. Is this the type of policy that you think would greatly increase well-being? And can you explain the position from Westminster compared to that?
I do recall, I mean, I have a daughter who went to St Andrews. I have a son-in-law who's Scottish, a grandson who's Scottish, and I have a position at the University of Glasgow. It's clear that there were a couple of policies, if my recollection, which were very popular, which was free education at the Scottish universities for the Scots. So my son-in-law went to St Andrews and didn't have to pay. And then I remember also, you know, the freeing up of the tolls on the bridges, which had positive benefits to people. I mean, these kinds of measures are pretty popular, it seems to me. I mean, especially in a period where the economy has been struggling. You're in recession. I mean, Gordon Brown has been pushing it. I mean, when he was Chancellor, he's been pushing it as the UN Child Ambassador. He's been pushing it, and in columns he's been writing in the Guardian recently. I mean, it looks to me like an incredibly sensible thing to do. I would have thought. I mean, the evidence that I see is that the well-being of people is impacted by. I mean, I'm going to finish with this. I love this quote. I have three of kids. My wife has 3, so I have 6 kids and 10 grandkids. And my view is that my well-being is basically determined by the well-being of the least happy of my 16 and my wife. So I take the view that the well-being of others is a really big deal. And the evidence in the data is that that's true. And so, you know, I think it's a really great thing to go and improve child poverty, try and be the front runner to that, and devote resources to it because it has positive effects. But I'm just going to stop, and obviously I have to go teach now. But I think, in a sense, the way to think of all of this is people's well-being is raised by investing in people, and especially investing in children. And I think if you think about the ill-being of the young that I've talked about, the country's going to be better off if you invest in trying to improve their well-being and do something about this social event. It has a priority. Just like if you have a pandemic come and you were invaded, what would you do? So you need to prioritize and stop going with the silly nonsense about we can't afford this. Of course you can afford it.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Danny, thank you so much.